Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for having us. On behalf of all of us at Protect Our Kids, we really want to thank you for having us here to speak to you. I want to introduce you first here to our founder, Mark Schneider. He's over here. And I'm his younger brother, George Roscoe. Mark is a lawyer by trade. He grew up doing patent law and litigation for some big-time companies, was legal counsel at Hewlett-Packard for a long, long time, and then went over into private practice. But Mark fellowships at Calvary Chapel East Anaheim, not too far from here. He leads their Salt and Light ministry, and he's been very, very involved in California politics here for the last 15, 20 years. Mark's going to continue talking about what is critical race theory and historical revisionism.
So when we started POK, comprehensive sexuality education was the only thing that we were having to contend with. Our entire ministry was built on informing good people like you about what's going on in the school system and how they're indoctrinating our children. But over the last 18 months, there are two other threats now that have come to the fore that are equally, if not even more threatening to the welfare, not just of our children, but as our nation, as our society. And the first of these is critical race theory. It's been in the news a lot, so I'd be surprised if you haven't heard about it. Fortunately, this has been working for us. But what critical race theory is, it's a new form of class warfare. Instead of the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, it's ethnic classes being pitted against each other. And this is actively being taught now throughout our K through 12 education system. And I'll give evidence of that in just a moment. Race, according to critical race theory, is the primary human characteristic. Everything else takes second fiddle. Race defines you as the person. It should be foremost in your mind in everything we do. How foreign was that to Martin Luther King's edict that we judge people not based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character? Critical race theory throws that out the window. There are only two classes in critical race theory, oppressor and oppressed. If you happen to be light-skinned, you fall into the oppressor category. If you happen to be of darker skin, then by definition, you're one of the oppressed. America is a systematically racist country. All whites are privileged, all blacks are victims and helpless. Collectivism is good. Capitalism is bad. Yes. What does capitalism have to do with race? Everything, according to critical race theory. And the ends justify the means to teach what is clearly a form of indoctrination. But where did critical race theory come from? Was it just invented out of whole cloth in the last 20 years? Oh no. This goes back all the way back to the Weimar Republic in Germany by the Institute of Social Research, otherwise known as the Frankfurt School. Probably not many of you have heard of this, but you will in the future. The Frankfurt School was basically a group of Marxists run by people like Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, and then an Italian named Antonio Gramsci came into the scene years later. And basically what they taught is that Marxism is the goal. Collectivism is the goal. But we will not be able to do it by what they call a war of position. Meaning, Western society is not ready, it's not available for revolution. The classes like each other, everybody's getting along, people are making money, they have liberty, and so we cannot do a war to bring about Marxism like they did during the Russian Revolution. What we have to do is change their most critical society instruments, like the government. But before the government can change, we need to change social institutions, starting with the universities, media, social repositories, and the public school system. So they set about on a campaign to do just that. And that started really in the 1850s. Social Marxism was started at the Frankfurt School. It was exported to Columbia University by men like John Dewey. And there it made its way to our most prestigious public universities. And ultimately that led in the 1960s to what George has already spoken about, which is the sexual revolution. Our laws began to change. Bible reading and prayer were both taken out of school in two famous cases in the 1960s. This led to ultimately the overthrow of the Judeo-Christian worldview being taught in the public school system. And that happened in the late 60s to early 70s. You heard that quote that George gave by the university professor, Alan Bloom, very famous. He wrote The Closing of the American Mind. And even in 1980, he could see, and that was 41 years ago, where Alan Bloom said, all of the freshmen coming to our college campuses now say that they're relativists. Here's a picture of Columbia University, where critical race theory really took off many, many decades ago. But who are the people today who are most responsible for pushing this agenda ahead? One of them is Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the famous book, White Fragility. Another one is Ibram X. Kendi, maybe a name you've heard. He's a professor at Boston University. That's not his given name, by the way. Richard Delgado and Jan Stefanik, who wrote Critical Race Theory. Kimberl Crenshaw and Cheryl Hannes at UCLA, very prominent people. Kimberl Crenshaw came up with this term, intersectionality, which, as George pointed out, is victim identity politics. And then finally, the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patricia Kullars and Alicia Garza. So these are the modern faces behind critical race theory. Why is it dangerous to our children? Well, number one, it indoctrinates them into a false and foreign worldview. It is a lie. It promotes a new form of class warfare. You remember the Latin expression, e pluribus unum? Do you know what that stands for? It's one of our founding ideals. In fact, if you want to know what our founding ideals are, Dennis Prager is fond of taking out a coin, and inscribed on that coin, even today, is the three words, in God we trust, liberty, and e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. America was known for 2 centuries as being the great melting pot. It didn't matter who you were or where you came from. We were going to provide you with the same set of laws. Everybody was going to be governed by the same system with the same opportunities. Now, yes, slavery was an incredibly terrible sin, and we have paid a great price for it. But that concept of that melting pot was still with us, and it provided the greatest freedoms of any country in the face of the earth. But critical race theory throws that out the window. There is no e pluribus unum. There's only the oppressed and the oppressors. Critical race theory even denies objective truth. I'm not making that up. You can read a textbook that's widely used by Margaret Anderson, where she challenges the idea of objective truth to her college students. The goal behind critical race theory is unabashed. It's to overthrow Western civilization. It's not only happening here in the United States, it's happening all around the Western world. It's invading our primary education system. Here's a statement by the American Association of School Superintendents. We are living at a time of obscene inequities, and merely trying to compensate is not enough. Now is the time for all educational leaders to intensify our commitment and address inequalities and work to dismantle systemic racism. Leading a system-wide effort requires that we ensure that cultural responsiveness permeates all levels of the district, from teaching and learning to buses and buildings, to all levels of professional development and community engagement. This is a very well-known, prestigious organization, and it's happening, starting in New York. Buffalo school system adopted what they called the culturally and linguistically responsive initiatives, which is their euphemism for critical race theory. And then Even Tucker Carlson picked up on this and said the Buffalo school system is teaching students to question the nuclear family as part of the BLM integrated curriculum. And this is one thing that we've discovered. Comprehensive sexuality education, critical race theory, and historical revisionism, they all use the same terminology. They intermix their agenda because they're out for the same goal. Moving on from New York, in Illinois, the Illinois School District adopted a BLM-based curriculum. Here's an interview between a man who is interviewing Patricia Coolers, one of the founders of BLM, saying, well, one of the criticisms that you have of your organization is you don't seem to have any clear ideology. Can you address that? And maybe you can listen to what her answer is.
Clear ideological structuring might be of some value here, but how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticism?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
Did you catch that?
Yep.
We are trained Marxists. That is the ideology behind this. And it's working. In the Rockwood School District in Missouri, 5th grade teacher, Westwood Elementary School, distributes handout with experts written by BLM co-founder. It's not even an approved resource, but it's quickly becoming approved around the country. Bellevue, moving on to the West Coast in Bellevue, Washington, we're seeing the same kind of thing. Moving down to Oregon, we have another ethnic studies program. And then finally, here in California, we always tend to be on the bleeding edge of these movements, and this is no exception. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend that you follow a journalist. His name is Christopher Rufo. He writes for the City Journal, and Christopher has dedicated his recent life to uncovering what's going on with critical race theory. He writes brilliant arguments, and he's got a 12-article expose on this movement. You can find it at the City Journal. So these kids now in Cupertino, parents caught them being indoctrinated on deconstructing their racial identities. And here's how they do it. This is just one example. This one happens to be by Barner Hess, The 8 White Identities. And if you're confused about which one you reside in, then you can look at this guide and you can figure out how much of an oppressor you actually are. The good news is parents are starting to push back. In Nevada, there's a case that's going on right now, Gabriel Clark versus Nevada State Public Charter School, where this boy, the mom is black, the dad was white, I think, or maybe I've got them reversed, but the young man came from an interracial family, and he was being forced to deconstruct his identity in the classroom, a high schooler, and he decided, I'm not going along with this. This is not what my parents, both his parents were believers, and I'm not going along with this. He refused, whereupon the teacher disparaged him publicly in the classroom, gave him a failing grade, and told him, if you didn't do this exercise, you're not going to graduate from high school. Whereupon the mother took the charter school district to court, and so far they're doing very well. But it's just the beginning. It's not enough. We need a lot more being done. George mentioned to you that for comprehensive sexuality education, California Department of Education adopted what they called a framework, which offers a guideline on how to actually teach CSE. In critical race theory, the same thing has been done. Just recently, in fact, in March, The ethnic studies framework, which is not 700 pages long, it's 800 pages long, was also approved by the California Department of Education. And you can expect that curriculums based on that framework will soon be rolled out. What are some of the things that are being taught in accordance with the framework? Address the concept of intersectionality, the power structures and forms of oppression, the double helix of holistic humanization and critical consciousness. We're going to learn to critique empire building and its relationship to white supremacy. We're going to challenge the imperialist colonial beliefs and practices such as patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy. You'll become familiar with these terms. Anti-indigeneity, Islamophobia, and transphobia. Now, what do these have to do with the color of their skin? Islam and transphobia. But here we are, same terminology. Place high value on ancestral knowledge. The biblical worldview that America was founded on has been thrown under the rug in critical race theory. We are now going to go back to what are essentially pagan and tribalistic roots, and I'll show you proof of that in just a second. Explore the history, struggles, and triumphs of the LGBT community. This is part of critical race theory. Christopher Rufo wrote this article called Revenge of the Gods. He also looked at the ethnic studies curriculum from California, where he uncovered the fact that California's, it's not proposed anymore, it's been approved, curriculum urges students to chant to the Aztec deity of human sacrifice, not animal. BLM co-founder, LA chapter leader, discusses groups' occultic practices of invoking spirits, including African ancestral worship. You think I'm making it up? These are texts right out of the California Department of Education's framework for ethnic studies. Kids are being urged to participate in what they call the unity clap, and also Inlek Ak affirmation. Inlek Ek is a Mayan expression for pagan universalism. Everything is interconnected. Tezcatlipoca is the Aztec god of providence, or as Encyclopedia Britannica describes it, the cult god of the Great Bear constellation. Quetzalcoatl relates to the Aztec god of the wind, Venus, the patron god of the Aztec priesthood. If you'll remember Mayan culture and Aztec, they regularly murdered people having human sacrifices. This was part of their ancestral knowledge. Finally, Hunabku, the Aztec god for one being, head of the Mayan pantheon. Our kids are being encouraged and sometimes forced to engage in these chants to these Aztec gods. This is in the California framework curriculum. Here's a video by Max Eden from the Manhattan Institute, kind of summarizing that today there is no apolitical classroom.
Do you know what's going on in your kid's school? If not, now would be a good time to take a look. Here's what you're likely to find. According to the education establishment, the purpose of public education is no longer just to teach the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It is to awaken students to the fact that they live in a country that has been, remains, and will probably always be racist. Here's how the American Association of School Administrators, AASA, recently described its mission. At a time of obscene inequities, merely trying to compensate is not enough. AASA's work must go further and become actively anti-racist. Being anti-racist sounds simple and laudable. Treat everyone the same, a version of the golden rule. What could be wrong with that? Nothing, except that's not what the educational elite means by anti-racism. Anti-racism, in its current formulation, does not mean equal treatment of others. It is an all-encompassing ideology that demands that white people accept that their behavior is either implicitly or explicitly racist, and has been for at least 400 years. The catch-22 here is that to say you're not racist only proves how racist you really are. That is, you are so racist you don't even know it. And if this accusation upsets you, that's proof of your white fragility. Education Week's Classroom Q&A blog tells teachers that, as Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, would say, there is no not racist. There is only racist and anti-racist. Your silence favors the status quo and the violently oppressive harm it does to black and brown folk everywhere. What Kendi is saying is, if you don't voice active agreement with him, you are a racist. And if you treat people equally, regardless of race, you're also a racist. Anti-racists embrace racial discrimination, as long as it's done on their terms. As Kendi has said, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. I understand how wrong this might sound. It turns the Martin Luther King concept of racial equality on its head. But that's exactly the point. Lorena German, who chairs the Committee on Anti-Racism for the National Council of the Teaching of English, makes this clear. At the height of the recent urban unrest, German wrote that arsonists should serve as a model for teachers. Educators, what are you burning? Your white-centered curriculum? The school's racist policies? Your racist-ass principal? The funding for police and schools versus counselors? What are you burning? German's call to commit arson may have been metaphorical, but her call to get rid of the traditional school curriculum is not. A lesson plan created by the New York City Culturally Responsive Education Working Group, Transforming Our Public Schools, a guide to culturally responsive and sustaining education, tells teachers that the whole Western canon is rife with horrible stories and atrocities of who we are as people of color. For their part, the National Committee on Social Studies has promised to flood our children with counter-messages until there is no racial inequality in economic opportunity, no racial inequality in education, no racial inequality in incarceration rates, and no brutality from police and others. If that sounds to you a lot more like political indoctrination than education, you would be right. New York State now encourages teachers to incorporate current events, even if they are controversial, into instruction, and to utilize tools that encourage students to engage with difficult topics, power, privilege, access, and equity, constructively. We might all wish that as cultural and political polarization reaches into more and more areas of American life, schools could remain an apolitical oasis where children can learn to read, write, and develop skills of socialization. But if that's what you want for your children, then just know that anti-racist educators think that you are part of the problem. According to a writer for Teaching Tolerance, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center, anti-racist educators recognize that schools today are doing exactly what they were built to do in this country: exclude, silence, erase, promote white supremacy. An anti-racist approach to schooling could very well mean an ending to schools as we know them. That is certainly true. The National Council on the Teaching of English insists there is no apolitical classroom. The educational elite has a very clear lesson plan in mind for your children. If you're okay with it, you can send Johnny and Jennifer off to school with a glad heart. If you're not okay with it, better talk to the principal, or get ready with a plan B. I'm Max Eden, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip very quickly through these next few slides. I encourage you to read the material on your own. Basically, historical revisionism weaponizes critical race theory. It's actually teaching why critical race theory is so important. So I'm not going to go through these, but you can read them yourself. I do want to point one thing out, though. The good news is that the opposition to critical race theory is not just coming from the white community. It may surprise you, hope it shouldn't surprise you, but there are many, many people of color intellectuals that are speaking vociferously against this. The list is very long. One of my favorites, one of my heroes is Robert Woodson of the Woodson Institute. He's recently written a book that's going to be published soon called Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. And he also has a project called the 1776 Unites Project, where a group of black intellectuals have gotten together to refute everything that critical race theory stands for. This is also very positive news. So what can you do? So George and I are going to answer questions here in a moment, but just very quickly. You've started the process by being here this morning, and that is getting informed. You can't get engaged until you're informed. So I do encourage you to go to our website, read the material, investigate this stuff for yourself. Don't take our word for it. Find out yourself. And then, if you can, we do urge parents to get their kids out of the public school system. If the public schools are going to be redeemed, it's not going to happen in time. I'm sorry. Let's see here. It's not going to be happening in time to rescue your kids. That's probably a long process. Track pending legislation. The CaliforniaFamily.org website is a great place to go to find out about pending bills that impact critical race theory, comprehensive sexuality education, and historical revisionism. Vote your values. It's shocking how many people of faith are not taking advantage of their constitutional right to vote. You need to vote in every single election, and not just national elections, but local and county as well. Support school choice. There's an initiative going on right now. It's underfunded, and that's why we need more people to hear about it, called CaliforniaSchoolChoice.org. This is not a voucher system. It's an education savings account, which will allow parents to send their kids to the private school of their choice. They're hoping to get that on the ballot in 2022. And finally, speak up. Speak up. Martin Luther King, again, one of my heroes, said, "Our lives begin to end the day we stop speaking out about things that matter." We've been silent for far too long. Now is the time to make noise. Our children and our nation depend upon it. Thank you. God bless you. George and I will take questions now.